What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be talking about the basics of tank builds in Star Trek Online. Now, I'm not good at a lot of things, but there are two things I am very good at. Being lazy and calling attention to myself. Now, I'm not good at a lot of things, but there are two things I'm very good at. Being lazy and calling attention to myself. That's why I do all this. That's also why two of my greatest creations in Star Trek Online have been my lazy boat and my tank builds. When I first started outlining this build basics series, enough of you requested that I cover tank builds, so let's get to it. Tank builds are very much a support role in Star Trek Online. Their purpose is to generate threat to draw aggro from enemy targets and to survive it. These really aren't necessary in advanced level TFOs, but they're very useful in several elite TFOs. They're also pretty nice for solo play as well because of their strong focus on survival. Though for solo play you don't have to worry about threat generation, so you can put more focus into damage and survival. Some of you might be asking right now, what is threat and how do you generate it? Threat is basically a measurement of how dangerous enemy NPCs think you are. The player generating the highest amount of threat is going to be the primary target of anything within weapons range. Pretty much anything you do is going to generate some amount of threat, whether it be dealing damage, healing, or whatever. But there are several ways to increase or decrease the amount of threat you generate, though for today we're just going to be talking about increasing threat. The first and easiest way is to activate Threatening Stance. What Threatening Stance does is increase your normal threat generation by 300%, and also gives a chance to increase your maximum hull anytime you get attacked. This is a normal captain's ability, all players will have this automatically. Just remember that only the tank player should have this active. There are also various personal traits and starship traits that will help with increasing your threat generation as well, several of which interact with Threatening Stance, so that you'll only get that extra threat when that's active. Like I said earlier, pretty much anything is going to cause some amount of threat, mainly dealing damage, debuffing an enemy, or healing an ally. Doing as many of these as possible to as many targets as possible will generate more threat, which is why Fire at Will is a key element to pretty much all tank builds. Fire at Will rapidly deals damage to multiple targets all at once, and depending on what kind of weapons you're using, you'll also be able to add a debuff or a damage over time proc, which will generate even more threat. Or if you're using Baul weapons, you'll be able to increase the number of targets you're hitting because of the refraction proc. Any of these options are good, but it just means you're going to want to be mindful of what kind of weapons you're using, because you'll want to be using something that benefits your threat generation. Now, because Fire at Will is going to pretty much be the backbone of your tank build, you're going to need the extension trait to extend its duration. If you watched my energy weapon build basics video, you probably already know which traits I'm going to talk about: Entwined Tactical Matrices and Redirecting Arrays. Now, when I last talked about Redirecting Arrays, I went on about how it's not very good because it requires you to get shot at, but that's not really a problem for a tank build. That said, I would still recommend Entwined Tactical Matrices over Redirecting Arrays. Redirecting Arrays is still reliant on outside factors, whereas Entwined Tactical Matrices is pretty much guaranteed to keep Fire at Will up 100% of the time. Now, the primary goal of a tank is to generate threat, so that way all enemies will attack you instead of the rest of your team. But another important factor is that you have to be able to survive those attacks. One of the best ways to do this is with passive hull heals, meaning use consoles or traits that let your ship heal automatically instead of being reliant on your bridge officer powers for heals. A common way to do this is with energetic protomatter matrix infusers. Think of these as the tank versions of vulnerability locators. You still get the buff to your damage type, but instead of crit chance, you get a chance for some hull and shield healing every time you activate a special firing mode, which in this case is going to be Fire at Will and probably Torp Spread as well. You'll probably want 3 or 4 of these to get enough heals out of them. There are other ways to get passive heals too, other consoles, starship traits, even duty officers, but you're definitely going to want these protomatter infusers. They can be found at the Drenor Fleet Colony. Buffing your hull regeneration is a good idea too, that way you get more out of those passive hull heals. Again, there are plenty of ways to do this, but one way I definitely recommend is the Discovery 3-piece set from the Reputation. You actually only need 2 pieces to get the hull regen bonus, which is the 2-piece set bonus, but I would throw in a 3rd piece as well to get access to Mycelial Lightning, which is nice for generating more threat. Temporary hull can also be pretty valuable for tanking, and the best way to get that is from the Hull Image Refractor's passive ability. Anytime you get an incoming heal while your hull is at maximum, that heal is instead applied as temporary hull for 30 seconds. This includes passive heals as well, like you get from the protomatter infusers. One of the nice things about this console is that while it is a lockbox console, it's not bound to a ship, so you can find it relatively cheap on the exchange. While this kind of hull tanking is one option for you, another is shield tanking. Though I really just say that as a joke, because shield tanking is not a thing. Well, it's technically a thing, just not a very good thing, especially against the Borg. The thinking there would be the same. Instead of throwing effort into hull regen and hull heals, throw it into shield regen and heals. But the problem with shield tanking is that too many things break down shields way too easily, and there are plenty of other things that bypass shields altogether. So yeah, you can try shield tanking if you want, but trust me, it'll never be as good as even a mid-range hull tank. Now, with all this talk of heals, I feel like I should bring up the dangers of over-tanking. This is when you've put too much effort into survival and you have compromised your ability to generate enough threat. Tanking is a constant balancing act of trying to maintain survival and threat at the same time. It's going to be different for everyone depending on your build, but keep it in mind when building your own. You don't want to overdo it with the heals. Now that covers most of the build stuff, so let's move on to the actual ships you're going to want to use. Cruisers are generally your best option for tanking, especially ones with the Attract Firepower command aura. Attract Firepower not only increases your own threat generation, but also decreases the threat generation of any nearby allies. It also increases your defense rating depending on the number of allies within 5 kilometers of you. This is kinda why battle cruisers aren't great for tanking. They don't have Attract Firepower. Same with the new multi-mission cruisers. I mean, it's doable, but you're just making tanking harder on yourself by not having Attract Firepower. But most other cruiser types do, so those should work fine. I generally prefer command ships for tanking, largely because of the inspiration abilities. There's a great damage buff in there and a great heal buff, both of which are applied to the whole team when activated. These both really feed into the whole support role of a tank. Several command bridge officer abilities can be really helpful too. Overwhelm emitters and suppression barrage are both great for generating threat, and concentrate firepower is going to help the damage of the rest of the team. It also means anyone running a torpedo build is going to love you. That said, these are not requirements for a tank build, so don't feel like you're obligated to use a command ship. And lastly, to wrap things up, your captain specializations. You'll want to use Miracle Worker as your primary, because this will buff your heals and damage resistance in several ways. For secondary, again, I like Temporal Operative for Entropic Rider. That extra physical damage over time is really useful for generating some additional threat. That said, Strategist is also a good option, especially if you're needing a little bit more help with survival. With Threatening Stance on, you gain some heal buffs with logistical support, and it turns Diversionary Tactics into a taunt, meaning you'll generate more threat. But like I said, I prefer Temporal for threat generation. Entropic Rider is going to be far more consistent for threat generation, because it's a passive ability that will always be up. Diversionary Tactics is an activated ability that has a cooldown of, I think, a minute or two, meaning you're only going to get a handful of uses out of it. So yeah, those are the basics for tank builds in Star Trek Online. I hope it helps you in creating your own. That wraps up my Build Basics series because there really isn't much else left to cover that isn't some weird niche build. I mean, I guess there's still nanny builds, but I don't even have one set up right now. And honestly, I don't think that would end up being a long video. It's literally just do nothing but debuffing. I don't know, maybe one day, but for now I want to move on to other projects. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or I will peck you in the face like a bird. You thought I was kidding last time, didn't you? Click the button.
I said click the button!